Medieval castles were not just giant stone structures. They were created to confuse, trap, and stop intruders from getting inside. Every feature served a clever purpose. Some ideas were straightforward, others were surprisingly sneaky. Yet all of them were effective. Here are 10 smart ways castles outsmarted anyone who tried to lay siege to them. The first trick began outside the outer walls. Moats acted as the original stay-away signs of medieval strongholds, and instead of a small wooden post, they were enormous trenches filled with water that circled the entire fortress. These were not peaceful ponds where you could toss a coin and make a wish. They were serious defenses meant to frustrate attackers. Here is something many history books do not mention. Moats were not always filled with fresh or pleasant water. Many castle residents did not care what ended up in those trenches. Some moats were simply dry pits that made climbing difficult. Others held whatever people threw out their windows. Yes, including all their human waste. Nothing says welcome quite like a moat filled with medieval toilet contents. The average moat ranged from 5 to 30 feet deep and 10 to 50 feet wide. Not something you could casually jump over. This huge obstacle made the use of siege tools extremely difficult. Try pushing a heavy battering ram through water that reaches your waist. Siege towers would sink into thick mud, and ladders could not reach across the open gap. Some very cunning designers placed wooden stakes just below the surface of the water. Imagine walking through filthy water, only to be stabbed by sharp posts you never even saw. Many moats had slanted muddy sides that turned into slippery traps when wet, almost like a medieval slide that ended with archers shooting at you. In winter, you might assume a frozen moat would make crossing easier, but defenders would crack the ice or pour hot water to weaken it. One story describes attackers falling through thin ice while defenders shouted and called them human popsicles. Even completely dry moats were dangerous. Defenders packed them with thorn-filled plants, sharp stones, and sometimes even dead animal bodies that spread sickness among invading soldiers. Nearly 40% of siege deaths came not from direct fighting, but from illness, caught while dealing with defenses like these. As powerful as moats were at stopping enemies, sometimes the real threat was not ahead of you. It was above your head. If you managed to get across the moat, you would face another clever defensive trick. After fighting through the moat, drained attackers would reach what looked like shelter under the entrance of the gatehouse, only to learn that medieval builders had a nasty surprise waiting. Murder holes, those plain-looking openings in ceilings above passages and gateways, turned what seemed like safe ground into a dangerous trap. Think of it as the worst possible shower you could ever stand beneath. These defensive openings earned their grim title for a clear reason. Castle guards stood above these gaps with a full supply of unpleasant greetings for unwelcome intruders. Hot water was the most common choice, not because defenders were unusually cruel, but because water was always nearby and could be heated quickly. Medieval warriors soon learned that problems with hot water carried an entirely different meaning when you were trying to storm a fortress. Defenders showed no concern for elegance in their choice of projectiles. If an object caused pain when it landed on a helmet or a skull, it was suitable for use through a murder hole. Hot sand grew especially feared among those attacking, because it slid into the small spaces between armor pieces and kept burning long after it touched the skin. Some fortresses dropped stones, which worked impressively well when released from a height of 40 feet. Nothing ruins an assault quite like receiving a direct hit from medieval falling stones. Despite common stories, boiling oil was seldom used. Oil was costly and far too important for cooking to be poured away on attackers. Records from Dover Castle mention that during one long siege, guards released more than 2,000 gallons of heated water, 500 pounds of stones, and barrels of old kitchen scraps through their murder holes. Some unlucky fighters were struck with rancid stew from the previous week, a humiliating end by medieval leftovers. Most murder holes measured from 6 inches to 2 feet across, small enough to shield defenders, yet large enough for accurate aim. Many castles included hidden openings that only became visible when intruders stepped directly beneath them. The fear they created was often more powerful than the actual injuries. One medieval account describes soldiers refusing to move forward even after the gate was broken because danger reigned from above. Even the boldest fighter reconsidered charging ahead when the ceiling itself seemed determined to finish him. If attackers survived the moat and escaped the murder holes, their troubles were not finished. The clever defensive designs of medieval strongholds continued to reveal new dangers with every step deeper into enemy territory. Recently, I had no idea what a health ring was until my partner gave me one, and I have to admit, I am surprised this product is not widely known or used. It monitors my stress levels, and I soon discovered that certain supplements cause my stress readings to rise, while others helped bring them down. I made a few changes based on that information, and I genuinely feel younger. My wife uses it mostly to monitor her monthly cycle, and she is completely focused on her sleep score. I saw they currently offer a limited 69% discount, but I do not know how long that will continue. Right now, the price is only $60, and the value is clear. This option gives the best return for the cost, with other health rings priced near $350 while offering fewer features. They reach this low price by removing the middleman, such as Amazon or large retail stores, that raise costs and take a large cut, forcing customers to pay 3 to 5 times more. If you are watching on a television, you can view it by pausing the video and scanning the code on the screen, or by selecting the first link in the video description. Farther inside the castle, spiral stairways created another deadly obstacle for intruders who believed they were getting closer to victory. These were not decorative architectural features created to conserve space. They were carefully planned death traps disguised as ordinary steps. Medieval builders constructed spiral stairways with a deliberate clockwise turn as one climbed upward for a very clever reason. Most people used their right hand. When defenders stood higher on the steps striking downward, their right arms had the full open center to swing their blades freely. Attackers climbing upward, however, had their right arms pressed against the central column, greatly reducing their striking space. Talk about an unfair advantage for the people who live there. It is like playing a game of basketball with one team shooting at a hoop twice as high. The tight design of these stairways forced intruders to advance in a single line, removing any strength they had in numbers. Most castle spiral stairways measured about 3 to 5 feet wide, while some defensive ones were intentionally constructed only 2 feet across. Studies by archaeologists show that many defensive stairways had taller and more uneven step heights. Some steps were purposely set at irregular levels to trip attackers who did not know the stairway well. Historical accounts from the siege of Rochester Castle in the year 1215 describe how only 8 defenders held back more than 60 attackers on a spiral stairway for nearly 3 hours. People who fought with their left hand actually gained a rare advantage in such moments, which might explain why medieval society often viewed left-handed people with suspicion. Oh, you write with your left hand? Planning to attack any fortresses this week? Some very cunning castle architects added more tricks to their stairways. Hidden trapdoors could suddenly drop open beneath the feet of climbers. Small gaps in the walls allowed defenders to stab upward at intruders with thin blades. The steps themselves were often carved from stone. It became smooth after long years of use, forming slippery hazards when wet. And they often became wet during attacks when defenders poured water down onto them. Medieval knights likely feared stairways more than dragons. While spiral stairways presented clear dangers to invaders, even those who managed to climb them successfully often discovered an entirely new problem in the next defense. Medieval fortresses grew even more hazardous once attackers stepped further inside because of intentionally confusing layouts, false doorways, and passages that led to dead ends. Castle builders were not simply architects. They were experts in medieval misdirection who turned structures into elaborate puzzles. The interior designs of many strongholds deliberately confused intruders who did not know the corridors. Hallways would split into several paths, guiding attackers deeper into spaces where they could be trapped. Research on medieval fortress plans shows that more than half of all castles included at least 3 false corridors or passages, created specifically to disorient intruders. Fake doors ranked among the most clever tricks. These realistic-looking entrances might open into solid rock or tiny closets that captured overconfident attackers. At Dover Castle, researchers discovered evidence of 6 different false doors, all intended to waste an intruder's time or lead them into ambush points. It was medieval clickbait. This doorway leads to treasure. You will never believe what is inside. And then, it turns out to be a storage closet. Secret routes gave defenders another advantage, allowing them to move unseen through walls and appear suddenly behind enemy fighters. Defenders could vanish from one chamber only to emerge in another, giving the illusion that the fortress held far more soldiers than it truly did. Corridors that appeared to lead somewhere useful often ended abruptly, and many of these dead ends contained concealed arrow openings that allowed defenders to shoot at bewildered attackers who wandered inside. These narrow passages might look like routes to an important area, yet they stopped suddenly, leaving intruders exposed with no safe direction to escape. Some fortresses included stairways that twisted back toward themselves or circled endlessly. Bodiam Castle in England has a staircase that loops completely around, possibly sending confused attackers right back to the exact place where they began. Few things say you are lost quite like climbing steps for several minutes, only to finish at the same starting point. Medieval fortresses created the first Stairmaster experience. Think you located the treasure chamber? Enjoy the cleaning closet instead. Searching for the royal bedroom? Here is a solid wall. Hoping to find the exit? You will need luck for that. The confusion caused by these intentional architectural tricks often gave defenders valuable moments to plan a counterattack or arrange reinforcements. While intruders struggled with the fortress interior, defenders held another deadly advantage within the very walls around them. Have you ever attempted to hit a target while someone hurled stones at your head? Not simple at all. Medieval defenders had a far easier time thanks to arrow openings, narrow cuts in the walls that gave archers tremendous power in battle. These openings were precise defensive features that allowed archers to fire while staying nearly fully protected. From the outside, the cuts appeared as thin vertical lines in the stone, barely visible to approaching troops. Inside, however, the openings widened a great deal, giving defenders enough space to move, aim, and release arrows. A standard arrow opening measured only a few inches wide on the exterior, yet inside it could be nearly 3 feet across. This clever layout meant attackers had almost no realistic chance of returning a shot through the tiny outer gap. Trying to fire an arrow into one of these openings from outside was like attempting to toss a pebble into a soda bottle from the distance of a football field. Technically possible, yet mostly an exercise in frustration. As fortress design progressed, so did these defensive cuts. Early versions were simple vertical openings, while later forms included horizontal cuts that created a cross shape, allowing archers to shoot upward or downward at their enemies. A skilled medieval archer could fire around a dozen arrows each minute through these openings. During a normal siege, a fortress defended by only 20 archers could release more than 10,000 arrows in a single day of combat. Medieval armies did not have safe zones, only places where you would fall quickly or places where you would fall slowly. The psychological effect of arrow openings mattered almost as much as the physical danger they posed. Attacking soldiers could never tell where the next arrow would appear, creating constant tension and fear. Imagine playing a life or death version of Whack, a mole where the moles fire back, and you will understand why soldiers hated approaching fortress walls. While these openings protected archers, fortresses required additional defensive features for their main entrances. The primary entrance to a medieval fortress was not simply a door. It was a lethal defense system that included portcullises and falling bridges that turned the gateway into a trap. These heavy iron and wooden barriers were designed to drop shut at the first hint of danger. A portcullis was basically a massive iron or wooden grate that moved straight up and down inside grooves carved into the gateway walls. Instead of swinging open like a normal door, a portcullis dropped from above. Powered by a counterweight setup, it could slam into place in less than 3 seconds, quicker than most invaders could respond. Medieval construction records mention portcullises that weighed as much as 2 tons. You know that moment when an elevator door closes right as you step forward? Picture that, except the door weighs as much as a small car, and the bottom is lined with sharp points. That was a portcullis. Many fortresses did not rely on just a single portcullis. Dover Castle installed 3 separate portcullises along its main entrance tunnel, creating a deadly pressure zone. Any invader who broke through the first barrier found themselves stuck between 2 more portcullises, inside what fortress engineers grimly called a killing space. Drop bridges used a similar idea, but served a different purpose. Instead of lifting upward like a modern drawbridge, a medieval drop bridge was designed to fall. Some versions were built to collapse outward, flattening anyone unlucky enough to be standing underneath. Documents from the siege of Rochester Castle in the year 1215 describe how attackers spent 3 full days trying to force their way through the portcullis system before abandoning the attempt and digging beneath the walls instead. You might break through the first gate only to be crushed by the next one. Medieval castles were basically playing knock-a-knight with anyone who approached. Even if invaders managed to force their way past these fortified entrance defenses, they were still far from safe. Castle architects saved their nastiest tricks for anyone who believed they had finally gotten inside. Just when intruders thought they had conquered the entrance, they might learn that the floor itself could be a weapon. Hidden trapdoors and falling floors were among the most clever tricks in medieval fortress planning, turning what looked like solid ground into a sudden drop. These traps appeared in several forms. The simplest were basic trapdoors, parts of the floor attached to hinges that could swing open when triggered. More elaborate versions used sliding panels that moved sideways when a concealed lever was pulled. The most advanced systems relied on counterweight devices that could be activated from a distance. Builders placed these traps in strategic positions. Main hallways beyond the entrance were common locations, as were tight corridors leading to valuable rooms such as the treasury or the armory. The places where these trapdoors led were just as unpleasant. Some opened into simple holding cells where trapped attackers waited until defenders could decide their fate. Others dropped intruders into deep prison chambers with no easy way out. The most brutal versions ended in pits filled with spikes, making sure the intruders would never return to fight again. Watch your step was not just politeness inside a medieval fortress. It was a warning for survival. Trigger systems varied in design. Some relied on basic rope and pulley setups that defenders could operate by hand. Others were weight-sensitive, activating when someone stepped on a certain stone that carried enough pressure. Accounts from the siege of Chateau Galliard describe attackers who reached the inner walls, only to lose 20 men to a series of falling floors that dumped them into a sealed chamber below. Trapdoors did not only inflict injuries, they also worked as psychological weapons. Once invaders saw someone vanish into the floor, they became extremely reluctant to take another step. That hesitation gave defenders precious moments to prepare counterattacks or move important people to safety. Effective at thinning the enemy force inside the fortress, these falling floors acted as medieval crowd control, although far more permanent than simply asking people to stand in a straight line. Detecting these traps was nearly impossible because the floor stones looked exactly like the surrounding surface, and the mechanisms were often hidden behind walls or beneath carpets. Medieval castle floors were basically a deadly version of the game. The floor is lava, except the floor actually vanished, and the lava was often replaced with sharp stakes. While trapdoors handled intruders who managed to enter the fortress, defenders needed ways to stop enemies gathering outside. That is where the next medieval defense method entered the scene. Any attacker who reached the stone walls was met with a brutal surprise from above, boiling liquids and burning attacks. These scorching tactics turned the entire area around the fortress into what could be described as the most dangerous outdoor kitchen in history. Hot water was the simplest and most widely used liquid weapon available to defenders. It required no special materials, could be prepared quickly, and was always present in large amounts during a siege. When poured from high walls, it inflicted severe burns and turned metal armor into painful heat traps. Sand heated until it glowed red became an even worse weapon. Hot sand could slip through the smallest openings in armor and continued to scorch skin long after it touched the body. For medieval fighters, it was the worst possible beach experience. All of the sand, none of the relaxation, and everything was burning. Despite what popular movies show, boiling oil was almost never used in real battles. Oil cost far too much and was too important in cooking to waste on enemies. Pitch, a thick sticky substance, was far more common. When heated and set on fire, it clung to armor and weapons while continuing to burn fiercely. Kitchen waste often turned into weapons during long sieges. Boiling soup, cooking grease, and even spoiled stews were thrown down on attackers. Nothing says we rejected your dinner invitation like dumping old stew on someone from 50 feet above. One of the most powerful psychological weapons was simple sewage. Although it was not hot, it spread sickness among enemy troops and destroyed morale. Medieval armies had no hand sanitizer, and nothing ends an assault faster than soldiers who cannot stop getting sick. Fire arrows wrapped in oil-soaked cloth were used to ignite wooden siege machines. Battering rams, siege towers, and covered walkways were all vulnerable to these flaming attacks. While these burning defenses helped keep enemies away, castle guards understood that true survival depended on more than attacking from the walls. Large storerooms held preserved food that allowed castle residents to stay alive for months while the enemy suffered from hunger outside. Food storage was not just helpful in medieval fortresses. It was a vital part of defensive planning. Castle occupants used simple preservation techniques. Salt-cured meats and fish, while smoking was another reliable method. Grain formed the heart of a siege pantry, since wheat, barley, and oats could last for years. Records from Rochester Castle show it stored enough grain to feed 200 people for 4 months. Nuts, dried fruit, honey, and cheese completed the medieval supply stockpile. These foods were rich in calories and remained edible without spoiling. Honey never spoils. Archaeologists have discovered honey in ancient Egyptian tombs that was still safe to eat. Beer and ale kept better than water and helped maintain morale. During a siege, defenders might drink 3 pints per day, not for celebration, but because it was safer than the water supply. Many castles included wells built safely within the walls. The well at Dover Castle reaches 250 feet deep, ensuring that enemies could not cut off access to fresh water. If a siege dragged on longer than planned, the people inside the castle had to get inventive. Historical accounts describe defenders eating horses, dogs, cats, and even rats. Medieval castle cuisine could shift from royal banquet to anything that moved in record time. Castle gardens helped provide fresh vegetables during long sieges, and some fortresses kept livestock safely within the walls. Rationing systems stretched supplies further, with higher-ranking individuals receiving larger portions. Calling the cook stingy took on a whole new meaning when your dinner size decided whether the fortress could hold out another week. While strong walls and plentiful food were vital for outlasting sieges, Defenders sometimes had to rely on clever minds when resources grew scarce. Medieval castle guards used psychological tricks and false defenses to mislead attackers. These imaginative tactics were often as effective as physical barriers, yet required nothing but creativity. Fake guards placed along the battlements made fortresses look more heavily defended. Commanders would place helmets on top of spears and position them along the walls to mimic a full line of soldiers. From a distance, these dummy figures appeared real enough to make an approaching army hesitate. Torches carried along the ramparts at night created the illusion of constant patrols. Even with only a few guards available, moving lights in coordinated paths suggested a much larger force. It was medieval special effects, long before computer graphics, just men jogging around with fire, trying to fake an entire army. Fires placed behind arrow slits made it seem as though many archers were waiting to attack. By setting torches behind the narrow openings, defenders cast shadows that looked like armed soldiers ready to fire. Sound became another powerful tool. Blowing horns, beating drums, or yelling in unison created the impression of a larger defensive force. During the siege of Stirling Castle, records note that defenders used drums throughout the night to signal that new troops had arrived. Raising false banners from powerful allies sometimes tricked attackers into believing reinforcements were at hand. By flying the flag of a well-known military power, defenders could convince attackers to rethink their plans entirely. One lone castle guard even ended a siege by tossing a beehive at the attackers. The enemy assumed the defenders had endless supplies of angry insects and immediately fled. Medieval pest control often doubled as medieval crowd control. Exaggerating food supplies sometimes discouraged attackers from waiting out a siege. Defenders would display the remaining food openly to give the impression of abundance. A castle's reputation worked like a medieval version of an online review for invaders. 1 star, tried to invade, got attacked by bees, do not recommend. Medieval castles were more than stone structures. They were complete defensive systems that used strategic design, lethal traps, and clever tricks to keep enemies out and protect those inside.